Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Simmons State of the Union, How POTUS Affects Consumer Optimism. My name is Alice Little and I'm on the marketing team here at Simmons Research. I'll be moderating today's session, so let's quickly cover a few logistics before we get started. Given the high volume of attendees on today's call, we've placed everyone in listen-only mode. That said, if you have questions or comments throughout the session, please use the question and answer feature in your GoToWebinar panel. We'll address these at the end of the presentation. Today's speaker is Stephen Millman, Chief Scientist at Simmons Research. And at this point, I'll hand it over to Stephen.
Thank you very much. First of all, before I begin, I'd like to thank the contributors to this research, Jennifer Bowers, Gretchen Grabowski, and Tamara Barber. They did a lot of work in this, and the research couldn't have happened without them. So, welcome to Simmons State of the Union 2016 presidential election and the American consumer. As an introduction, no one needs to be reminded that the 2016 presidential election was a very contentious fight. It was between two very unusual candidates, one with a long and controversial history in politics, and the other one a businessman with no prior political or military experience. The webinar examines how the acrimony and deep divisions that define this election, this very unusual and unexpected election, have had with respect to how consumers have changed attitudes, how they've differed on their outlook on the economy and their own financial health, how Trump's association with brands might affect consumer choices, and how voters feel about their ballot choice now several months after the election. We'll start by looking at the effect on consumer attitudes and behaviors. We draw this information from the Simmons National Consumer Study. The Simmons National Consumer Study, or the NCS, is a syndicated commercial research service. It's a national study. It's a survey of about 25,000 adults. The universe includes both Hispanic and non-Hispanic, English-speaking and non-English-speaking. The important thing is that we are pulling sample all year round, which means we can break up the year by individual segments, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. The way we've decided to look at this is to see how the changes in the political landscape has affected the way people respond to questions in the NCS. As a comparison, we use the baseline period of January 1st, 2015 through December 31st, 2015, that entire year, when ostensibly there was no election running. One could argue that elections are running all the time. Certainly we see a lot of campaign activity well before elections, but research has shown that there's not a tremendous amount of attention paid. Then we have a primary election period, which we've defined as January 1st to July 31st, which gives us roughly the period of time between when people start paying attention and the primary season really starts to when the nominees Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were eventually, if not named, were clearly going to, clearly had identified winners. Next was the presidential election period following the primary election. This runs from August 1st, 2016 to November 8, 2016, that's election day, and focuses on the first past the post race between Hillary and Donald. The post-election period, and I've also been referring to this as the period of shock, where people start getting used to the idea of Donald Trump as president. That begins the day after Election Day and ends on inauguration. And then the early governing period, where people start being able to form opinions on what the president has actually done, rather than what their expectations were of the president-elect. So we looked at these individual questions and we broke them out into the period. So the way to understand this slide is among conservatives, moderates, and liberals, the progression in the change in the number of people who agree with the statement as you move from baseline to primary to presidential election period to post-election to early governing. So internet news, there's a lot of conversation about fake news on the internet, about reliability of news, and in general, has there been an increase in interest? Among conservatives, you can see a steady rise in interest. I should mention that where you see an arrow, that indicates that the change between one period and the other is statistically significant at the 95% confidence level. The question is, I get more and more of my news from the internet. And as you can see, for conservatives, this expands throughout the entire period with statistically significant jumps between the baseline and primary period, and again between the post-election and early governing period. Overall, you can see that interest in getting the internet from the news among conservatives rose about 9 points during this period. Neither liberals nor moderates overall see a change. You do see that liberals become much more interested in the news, about a 5-point jump, leading from the baseline to the primary election period. But that drops back down between the primary and the presidential election. So once the Bernie-Hillary question has been resolved, the internet news issue goes back to about normal. It's also interesting to note that while conservatives and moderates have roughly the same underlying interest in getting their news from the internet, liberals are about 10 points more likely. Interest in international events. Conservatives' interest in international events actually generally declines during the period from the baseline through primary, presidential, and post-election, and becomes much more interesting to them in the form of a 4-point jump, which is statistically significant, going from the post-election period to early governing, looking to see presumably how the new president is beginning to engage in the world. For moderates, there's very little movement. For liberals, there's a jump between the primary and the presidential election as they become more interested while Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are debating one another over international events. But that returns to something close to a baseline period after the election. One thing we were interested in looking at was this notion of feelings of isolation. And this comes from work that suggests that when you feel like, when you have a sense of hopelessness, that you tend to feel more isolated. And what you see is a substantial increase with the liberal group between the primary and the presidential election, and that may be the result of Bernie Sanders voters' disillusionment. It does decline back to baseline periods, to roughly baseline, a little lower, moving from the post-election to early governing. So whatever caused that bump was short-lived. For conservatives and moderates, although there's no statistically significant individual jump, you do see there is a trend to increase in I feel very alone in the world as you go from the baseline to the primary, presidential election, post-election, early governing. Caution you not to make too much of that because it's not statistically significant in any individual period, nor is it substantively very large. Civil protest. We had a lot of protests following the election and following inauguration. Many of them continue to this day. So we were interested in whether or not people felt like they would individually participate in civil protest between these periods. For both conservatives and moderates, the desire to participate in civil protests was low historically compared to liberals, where in the baseline period conservatives and moderates hover between about 25 and 28% on this, agreeing with this statement, whereas liberals in the baseline period agreed with it almost half. This declines for conservatives and moderates from the baseline to the primary to the presidential election, and sort of holds steady with moderates rebounding slightly, although it's not statistically significant. Liberals, on the other hand, see this interest drop from 46% in the baseline to 43% at the primary, 40% in the presidential election. And interestingly, only goes up a small amount in the post-election and not a statistically significant amount. However, once they've seen the presidents begin to behave in office, and there's no longer these questions about will he govern the way he campaigned, what kind of president will he be, there were a lot of questions about how much was rhetoric and how much was reality. Would he become more of a typical politician once in office? Once those questions were resolved to an extent in the liberals' minds, you see a 16-point jump in interest in participating, going from about 42% to about 59%. And this is naturally something that we see in the protests that did greatly expand post-inauguration. Now we're going to switch to more of a financial approach, and we asked in the coming 12 months whether you believed you would be financially better off now than you were, would you be better off financially 12 months from now than you are now? Among conservatives, another interesting thing here is that in the baseline period, conservatives, about 36% said that they felt they'd be better off a year from now versus 41% for moderates and 46% for liberals. It is likely the case that this is a function of having a Democratic president. We'll actually be looking at that later. But when you go from there's very little activity between the baseline primary and presidential election period, but when Trump wins unexpectedly, there's a 10-point increase in the degree to which conservatives believe that they'll be better off. Moderates dropped by about 5 points going from the primary to the presidential election. That may very well be a symptom of the pervasive notion, particularly among moderates, but even among some partisans, that the choices were very bad this year. Hillary Clinton, and the joke about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump that made a lot of press was Hillary Clinton is the least favorable presidential candidate in the history of American politics, except Donald Trump. So this dissatisfaction with choices generally may have led to the drop-off. It does recover after the election among moderates. Interestingly, liberals, there's very little change. None of it's statistically significant. The baseline and early governing period are about the same. So while self-identified liberals may have concerns, we'll see in the next slide, about the country, they don't seem to be worried terribly about their own personal income. Now, looking at whether the economy will be better off or worse off than it is now, so not myself as a person, but how do I feel like the country is doing, you see really radical differences. Conservatives hovered at about 18 to 20%, agreeing that the economy will be better off than in 12 months than it is now, whereas liberals started with about a little over a third of liberals feeling the same way. As the election progressed, conservatives feeling like they had perhaps not a lot of chance in changing who's in the White House, you see very little difference. However, when Trump wins the presidency, the percentage of conservatives who feel the American will be better off in 12 months than it is now jumped by more than double, going from 20% to 48%. That number rose, although not significantly, again into the early governing period, with a majority for the first time of conservatives feeling that the American economy will be better off in 12 months than it is now. For moderates, there was some disaffection going into the primary election. Again, there was a lot of evidence that moderates were very much disappointed with their options this year. I should say last year. However, in the post-election period, there was also a 5-point jump, meaning that moderates overall improved the outlook somewhat. And perhaps that's simply a sense of the return of stability, knowing that a decision's been made. And that, again, climbed, although not substantially, into the early governing period. For liberals, unsurprisingly, a very different story. Going from the baseline to the primary election period, there's a substantial drop. That may be, again, an indication of potentially the weakness of the field, that as a role, liberals didn't necessarily feel that either Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders were likely to be improvements over the Obama administration. After the election, however, there's another very sizable drop, this time going from 26% to 14.4%, and again, it drops a little into the early governing period, but not in a statistically significant way, suggesting that while they thought perhaps Hillary or Bernie would not be an improvement over the previous president, that Trump would be much worse. So net-net, you see nearly a tripling in the percentage of conservatives who feel like the economy will be better off when you look at the post-election period, early governing period, as compared to the baseline. And you see among liberals that the percentage that feel the economy will be better off drops to a third of its previous value in the baseline. Another indicator of financial concern is whether or not people expect to purchase homes in the next 12 months. So do you expect to buy your first home, a new home, or refinance a home? As you can see, conservatives, this goes up slightly over the course of the periods, with a statistically significant jump between the baseline and the primary. Not a lot to be said about that, other than perhaps that was an indication that after a long period with the wrong president, from their perspective, that maybe the field in the primary had given them some optimism. That rises slightly by the end of the early governing period, but again, not in a statistically significant manner. Among moderates, there's a steady decline going from the baseline to the primary to the presidential election. Again, very likely a consequence of the sense that all of the candidates perhaps were not to their liking, or perhaps none of these candidates would be good choices compared to where their hopes had been. It does, however, recover into the post-election early governing period, and actually ends up a little stronger than the baseline by the end. Again, not a statistically significant difference. Among liberals, it's fairly steady throughout the period until the early governing period. So again, while there was some shock for things, for example, like outlook on the American economy that happened right after the election, some things such as civil protest and whether or not you feel comfortable buying a new home, moving on to corporate ethics, a fair bit of conversation about this in the press, about how important is it that a company acts ethically, and this comes with bringing on his son-in-law, who has business interests that may conflict. The consistent argument by the liberals that perhaps Donald Trump is violating the emoluments clause of the Constitution by staying too tightly associated with his businesses, many of which interact with foreign nations. Overall, most people agree that it's important for companies to act ethically. It's slightly more liberals believe this than conservatives. What you see is very little movement in general. While there is among moderates a jump between the presidential election and the post-election period, that drops again into the early governing. Doesn't seem to be much of a change. For liberals, there's a small decline throughout this period that jumps into the early governing period, probably because of the conversations about emoluments and the concerns early in the presidency about what it means to have CEOs who are close to the president or brands that the president seems to favor. And we'll talk about that in the next section. So in summary, conservatives did show increased economic confidence as a result of the election. There were statistically significant increases in expectation around buying a new home in the next 12 months in terms of how they feel like the future of their own finances will progress over the next year, and to a extraordinary extent, the degree to which they were positive about where the country was going economically. And this is one of the things that Donald Trump talks about. He does talk about a renewal in confidence in the economy, particularly among small business owners and large businesses, which would, generally speaking, fall into that conservative group. Among moderates, there was some loss of financial confidence, some concern. Much of that across these indices simply bounced back after the election. Moderates did see a significant decline in the sense of their own financial future. Did rebound quickly, as I said, and their view of the American economy declined significantly. But once the instability of the election itself was over, it did again bounce back to the baseline period. Among liberals, they showed increasing anxiety and declining sense of economic confidence, except interestingly about their own. Liberals increasingly worried about themselves. They felt more alone in the world. They felt much more of a need to get out and protest post-election. Their views of the future of the American economy showed a very significant decline from the baseline to the primary, and then again from the presidential election to the post-election period. Also a significant decline in expectations around buying a new home. And then I've already mentioned the civil protests. So in this next section, we're going to talk more in more detail about what is the potential impact of Trump's relationships with brands on their consumers. A fair bit has been made about what does it mean when a company's CEO has a very public and favorable opinion of the president, or when the president has an open and favorable opinion of a brand. So the question we asked was, how would that likely affect consumer choice? To answer this question, we took advantage of the Simmons Omnibus study. Several times a year, Simmons fields an omnibus study that allows clients to ask their own questions to a sample, in this case about 2,000 U.S. adults, which we can then fuse back to the National Consumer Survey so that we can connect those new questions to the 60,000 or so variables and 25,000 respondents that we have. This is also, obviously, a great opportunity for Simmons to throw in a couple of questions and conduct research. The survey was fielded from February 27th to March 5th, 2017, and is weighted to the U.S. general population. So the first question was around chief executive support for Donald Trump. So we posed the question that if the CEO were to support Trump, would you prefer not to buy that from that brand? Would you in fact be willing to pay more at a competitor to avoid them? Alternately, would you prefer to buy a brand whose CEO supported Trump, and would you pay more to have that brand? Liberals are in blue, moderates in purple, conservatives in red, and the black bar is the average across all American adults. So, unsurprisingly, the folks who would prefer not to buy or who would pay more competitors, the liberals much more so than moderates or conservatives. And in terms of preferring to buy, again, unsurprisingly, conservatives much more so than moderates or liberals. One thing that you'll see here, and you'll see in other slides as well, is that the difference is dramatic between the degree to which conservatives would prefer to buy or would pay more for a brand, and how much liberals would prefer not to buy or would pay more a competitor. So if you think about the difference between liberals and conservatives as sort of a bellwether for how well or how much good or how much harm would be done to the brand, there's a 40-point difference between how much liberals and conservatives would prefer not to buy a brand that supported Donald Trump, but there's only a 30-point difference between how much conservatives would prefer to buy and liberals would prefer to buy. So if you think about that, another way of imagining the answer to that is that when you look at those two groups, there would be a net difference of 10 between those, and that would be harmful for the brand overall unless the brand primarily services a conservative consumer base. All in, there's very little in the survey that suggests that there's upside to being seen as close to the president. Going through them quickly, you can see that over 60% of liberals would prefer not to buy from a brand that was seen as supporting Donald Trump. Interesting also is that over 20% of conservatives would prefer not to buy from a company whose CEO supports Trump. That 20% is an interesting number. We'll get back to that. Go on to the next slide. So what about if Trump were to actually endorse a brand? And again, there's been a lot of questions about how that might play out. But the research here shows that a Trump endorsement of a brand could potentially be disastrous for that brand, again, unless the brand were predominantly conservative. You can see that conservatives would be more likely to use a brand as compared to liberals if Trump endorsed it, with 8.5% of liberals saying they'd be more likely to use a brand endorsed by Trump. Not sure who they are. And 32% of conservatives saying they'd be more likely to use a brand if it was endorsed by Trump. Less likely to use, however, you can see that 77% of liberals say they would be less likely to use it. 52% of moderates and 27% of conservatives. So thinking about that, if Trump were to actually endorse a brand, it suggests that you would see nearly 40% difference between less likely and more likely among moderates. A 70-point difference between liberals who are less likely to use and more likely to use. So big negatives. But among conservatives, only a 5% increase. So the damage done would be dramatic across all non-conservatives, and the benefit from conservatives would be weak. Also interesting, when we ask the question going beyond would you be more or less likely to use, but would you actively boycott a brand if Trump endorsed it? Unsurprising that a majority of liberals say that they would boycott a brand, and about a quarter of moderates. But it is interesting to note that over 17% of conservatives reported that they would actively boycott a brand endorsed by Trump. That 17 to 20% is an interesting number we'll get back to again at the end of the last slide, when we get to the last slide. So we thought, let's come up with an example and see in the real world what would happen when we look at a couple of different brands, looking at brands that are, excuse me, that have strong over-indexing for liberals, conservatives, and ones that look more or less about the country. As we started to look through this, I was surprised to identify that if you look at flour, the kind of flour you use to make bread, different brands of flour actually indexed very strongly against the liberal conservative index, depending on what you're looking at. Not clear to me why that is. It might be a geographic distribution. However, if you look at flour brands, King Arthur flour brand has a liberal index of 170. White Lily has a conservative index of 132, and that 170 and 132 are actually very high, respectively, among all brands with in terms of liberal or conservative indices. Gold Medal brand flour looks pretty much like the country at large. So you can see that graphically below. You can see Gold Medal more or less tracks exactly the same as the general population, very minor differences. Whereas White Lily, which has a conservative index, you can see has a much higher percentage of conservatives. Only 12.9% are liberals. And King Arthur has 36% liberals compared to 21% overall, and a smaller percentage of both moderates and conservatives. So what happens? So here's the potential impact of the CEO's support for Trump. The thing that, the way to interpret this is we've taken the prefer if CEO supports Trump would pay more if CEO supports Trump, which are the two blue bars. I apologize, I've done that wrong. It's prefer if the CEO supports Trump, prefer not to buy if CEO supports Trump. Those are the two blue bars. Prefer would pay more if the CEO supports Trump versus would pay more to competitor if CEO supports Trump, and those are the red bars. It's broken out for each of these brands, and then you see all respondents on the right. So that delta number above them is the difference between prefer not to buy and prefer to buy, or the difference between pay more to competitor versus pay more if CEO supports Trump. And what that suggests is looking at the users of the brand, the difference is that in every single case, support appears to be damaging to the brand. So if you look at the liberal flour, King Arthur, you can see that there's about a 17-point difference between prefer to buy or pay more if CEO supports Trump and prefer not to buy or would pay more to competitor. So that would be a very bad time for that brand. For Gold Medal, which looks like the general population, again, 9 to 10 point differences between these groups would be damaging. Going to White Lily, which is interesting, while these differences are much smaller, with the deltas about 2 and 5 respectively, they're still in the wrong direction. So even with one of the most heavily indexed conservative brand user bases, it's still not a net benefit, because although the conservatives are performing better, there's still enough moderates and liberals in the user base to cause the brand a problem. So looking across these cases, the conclusion is that a direct a direct connection between a positive connection between a CEO and support for Trump would likely be damaging. When you look at the potential effect of a Trump endorsement on product use, the problems actually look much worse. Here we have more likely to use if endorsed by Trump, less likely to use if endorsed by Trump, and would actively boycott in the dark red. For gold medal, which looks about like the universe, it's a 28-point difference. And again, when you look at white lily, still a very strong negative overall change. So while 21 or 22% would be more likely to use if endorsed by Trump, 42% would be less likely to use if endorsed by Trump. And again, as we've seen before, we see a little over 20%, in this case 24%, saying that they would actively boycott the brand with a brand endorsed by Trump, even among a highly conservative indexing brand like White Lily. So, moving on to our last slide, we asked a question related to this notion that perhaps some conservatives, having seen the president in office, were feeling a sense of buyer's remorse. There was a poll done by ABC, done for ABC by Langer Research Associates, that found no evidence for buyer's remorse. They asked a question about having voted for Trump in November, did you think it was the right thing to do? And 96% said, yeah, it was still the right thing to do. Only 2% said they regret it. So we thought it was a more interesting question to say not, do you still think it was the right thing to do, which is another way of saying, would you do it again? But we were curious about, was this really a lesser of two evils vote, or was it enthusiasm? And so we asked the following question: which of the following statements best describes your current feelings about the outcome of the 2016 U.S. presidential election? I'm happy Donald Trump is president. I'm happy that Hillary Clinton is not president, but I'm not happy that Donald Trump is president. I wish Hillary Clinton had become president, or I wish a third-party candidate had become president. Looking at all voters, you can see that 35% were happy that Donald Trump is president. 17% were happy that Hillary Clinton wasn't president, but are still happy that Donald Trump is president. About 31% wish Hillary Clinton had become president, and about 17%, which seems like a very large number, wishes that a third-party candidate had been elected. Among Trump voters, what's very interesting is that only 71%, 71.6% of those who voted for Donald Trump say that they're happy that he's president. That's a very different answer than would you do it again? So they would do it again, but only 71.6% are happy that Donald Trump is president. About 20%, just less than 20%, are happy that Hillary Clinton's not president, but not happy that Donald is president. And about 6.6% wish that a third-party candidate had been president. So when you look back at some of these prior slides where the data suggests that there's a fair number of people who would boycott a brand if Trump endorsed it who are conservative, this may be where that sentiment is coming from. There is a sense of a lesser of two evils. They're happy that Hillary Clinton is not president, and that overwhelmed any potential concerns they might have had about Donald Trump, even though Donald Trump clearly not the first choice for, it would appear to be around 25% of the electorate if you combine, the Trump voters rather, if you combine I'm happy that Hillary Clinton is not president, but not happy Donald Trump is president, with those that wish perhaps the third-party candidate had been elected, bearing in mind these are all Trump voters. And then similar to the 2% that say they regret it, about 2.7% say they wish that Hillary Clinton had become president. So it's very interesting how that theme runs through all the data. So in conclusion, I think Donald Trump said it best, that losers such as myself, use Trump for publicity for themselves, and I am, in fact, strictly third rate. Fortunately, this is also fake news. If you want to see what it's like to be insulted on Twitter by the president, you can go to Trump Generator, and that will produce some very fun tweets. Just enter your name. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I very much appreciate the opportunity to present our research.
We're at the top of the hour, so at this point I'd like to thank our speaker, Stephen Millman, and all of our attendees for joining today's session. The unanswered questions will be addressed offline. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.